The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
The most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good game's fast game, whānau.
Yeah, well, Ben's complaining about having to go.
No, go. You guys start. I'm just texting. Just go.
Wow, he's very edgy,
I'll pick it up. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'll get the gist real fast.
Very well.
Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. This is Gone by Lunchtime on the morning of September the 28th, 2022. Thank you to Te Ahi Butler, our producer, back on deck.
E mihi ana ki a koe.
Thank you to King Charles III, who's our head of state.
Kia ora.
Thank you to the bad boys of Brexit.
Aww.
And thank you to Spin-Off members. The wind beneath our wings. Ben Thomas is here, Annabelle Lee Mather is here, and Daylight Savings has shaken their cause, respectively. Before we get into it, and we will get into it, a quick mention of our live podcast that we're doing on October the 16th at the Escape Festival in Tauranga.
Yes.
Have you got that in your diary, Ben?
It is now. Pride of place.
Good.
I'm definitely going to be there.
It's going to be a good weekend.
Do you think we're going to need security to so we're not mauled by our fan base?
By the lunchtime stands.
It's going to be like when the Beatles came.
Yeah. What can we call it? The gone. No, it's not coming. This is the kind of magic
you can see this live.
Paying their money for. This is like when Paul McCartney came up with Get Back live on camera.
The unedited pod, the live experience is 6 hours long with 20 minutes of salvageable material.
Yeah,
It's a good question though.
Real BTS.
If the real pod has the cornies, what does Gone by Lunchtime have?
What's the real pod?
Yeah, good question.
I don't know.
At the Gone by Lunchtime live event in Tauranga, Jan Tinetti, rising star of the New Zealand Cabinet, will be with us, as well Tanya Tapsell, rising star of politics generally and candidate for the mayoralty in Rotorua.
Who may or may not be mayor. So there's I don't know what the percentages are, but there's a chance that we will be doing a rangatira to rangatira chat with the new mayor of Rotorua, or just some fucking loser.
Hey, do you reckon Jan Tinetti's going to tick off me and Ben for that time that we said we didn't know who she was?
Yes. I don't remember
Did I say I thought she was part of the Māori caucus?
Maybe. I can't remember.
I
remember that we said, who's she? We've never even heard of her. And then we got atted big time on Twitter.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, there we go.
We got big growlings.
Yep, you get the gags, you get the insights. It just never stops here. The other thing we were thinking of doing is we're going to bring along a series of 16-year-olds and just interrogate them and laugh at them as they weep, because that seems to be.
I've been practicing on my kids. Yeah.
I had a little bit of schadenfreude because I always get put up with these, make it 16 or whatever, and they always bully me on air. How do you like them apples?
All right. There was a poll last night, which is great. It's like like an open fire on a beach. We just gather around it and stare at it and just find weird shapes in it, even when they're not even there.
Love that.
What did it say? It said that basically it said everything is as it was. There was no sort of statistical change. I'm just trying to find the actual numbers.
Have you got a graph for the listeners?
Yep. Oh, shall I hold it up?
Yeah.
So, yes, National was steady on 37, Labour was up by non-statistically significant 1 point to 34, Greens and ACT still on 9. And if those numbers were to prove so on election day, then National ACT could form government but by 1 seat. So it's pretty tight. What do you take from it, Annabelle, in your in-depth psephological laboratory?
Well, I kind of think that both parties might be pleased with it. I think that National, obviously it's great for them to see that they could govern with ACT, although I think governing with just a 1-seat majority in an MMP parliament is probably not tenable, so they'll need to think about how they make friends with the Māori Party. But one thing that I imagine would be concerning them is to see that Christopher Luxon's personal popularity appears to have peaked and to now be slipping, because we know that when we get into the campaign proper, it's really going to be him against Ardern, and she is a seasoned campaigner, and, if you watch Question Time in Parliament, she usually runs rings around him, so I think they'll be worried that he has perhaps peaked too early. I think perhaps the real party vote race will be between ACT and the Greens, not that they're going to share voters between them unless you're Brooke Van Weldon. But in terms of their undecided vote, which of those two parties will be able to pick them up. And of course, the Māori Party look to be in a really key position coming into the election. And even if it's not a coalition as such, I think to be able to govern with strength and agency, the Māori Party are probably going to have to be there for either side, and it'll be about what those arrangements look like.
Well, they've said very clearly that they couldn't countenance the idea of working in any government alongside ACT, haven't they? So
they have, yeah.
Ben, I should mention that this is a Kantar poll for TVNZ because they're the ones that spend the money on it. So thank you, Kantar and TVNZ.
Thanks, Jessica and Mikey.
Soon to be ANZ PM, which is a whole separate shit show, which we won't get into now.
All the polling money will go towards sort of 1970s wall hangings for the new office to bring TVNZ up to speed. Sort of the Hobson Street's TVNZ headquarters will be retrofitted like a sort of 1970s Blake Seven style sci-fi show, just like the Wellington Radio New Zealand office.
I'm not sure that any of that cost a great deal of money. Ben, the poll. Do you, who would be happier? I mean, I suggested that the Labour might be feeling pretty relieved, that it seems to have stemmed, that it seems to have plateaued. No one delighted, I don't imagine.
No, that's right. So the momentum, maybe even the honeymoon period for National seems to have kind of slowed to a crawl / come to its natural end point. They seem to have gotten all of the, you wouldn't call it easy support, but all of the people who are sort of looking for permission to come home to National, the people who sort of may have been dismayed by the internal chaos in the party, the people who are sort of some of the people who are clinging sort of tenaciously to our COVID-beating Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. And now you've got a very, very even left-right split, which really reflects the electorate, and in the past has been sort of disrupted by the presence of parties like New Zealand First, who can kind of straddle the aisle or whatever. Yeah, I think Annabelle's right. The declining popularity of Luxon in these polls will be a concern. It doesn't necessarily mean, that's sort of the peak of Luxon momentum or whatever, because he will get more attention during the campaign. It's a bit of a truism. It's very rare for opposition leaders to be in the same kind of space as the Prime Minister in that preferred PM position. Part of it's just familiarity, part of it's name recognition, but part of it seems to be that, there is a big incumbency advantage in terms of that preferred number. So I don't think they'll be too worried about that, but they will be sort of, there might be a few second thoughts about, why has the momentum stopped? And there's a few reasons for that. Gas is still high, but it's not as high as it has been. There's other challenges in inflation. There's a lot more focus on food inflation right now. Wage growth still isn't really keeping up. Interest rates that are starting to bite on people. So the factors along with the change of leadership that have propelled National, haven't really come to a halt. But it seems that the sort of readily made gains have, and now it'll come down to really, there's the metaphor of the drag race, which I actually think is misapplied here, because the drag race is really when it's between two parties, whereas with ACT and the Greens still polling very strongly. I don't think it quite translates.
What about if it's outriggers or like with those what do you call
motorcycles with sidecars?
Yeah.
What about
a wacky races cartoon, Hanna-Barbera?
4-horse race, but
like
with
there's
the horse
two horses
on a horse.
Yeah, or like there's two horses and then two like miniature ponies.
Yeah, it's a Shetland pony riding a horse and they're racing each other.
Yes.
A Shetland pony on a horse with the leader of the party on the pony. No, on the... Yeah, go on.
And then there's a waka, which is the Māori party, but with wings.
With wings?
Yeah.
The government will probably be pretty relieved. They've had a torrid few weeks. The cost of living payment sort of gradually wending its way through most of the populated areas of the earth, like some kind of 15th century explorer.
and beneath there. In some cases.
Attracting more sort of negative press for that. On the other, but then the upside is that people have now received their second payment and they've got a third one coming. And
that helps. That's the original purpose of God knows it was a hell of a cluster on the way through, but it doesn't change the fact that there are a large cohort of people who have sent some money up to the account.
Yeah, and it will stop. That will give the government some pause, but it seems as if the sort of the natural forces have kind of done their work. Now, what the government will be, probably having a few sleepless nights about is the world economy. Things are not going great in Europe.
Yeah, well, the UK, excuse me, the UK I think is interesting in terms of the way the battle lines are drawing up here, right? Because National in the last few days have gone on the income insurance as a jobs tax, and Luxon in the House yesterday had a pretty good line, which was given what the government has done with its promised capital gains tax and its tax on KiwiSaver fees, GST tax as it was described, can New Zealanders have hope that they will also reverse the jobs tax, tum to tum? But when you look at the UK and what happened there, with admittedly a sort of scale difference, when you had the mini budget from Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, which had a big cut in the top tax rate as its headline, and that has caused kind of a cratering in some sense, caused a currency crash, and now bonds crashed, and so it basically means that in terms of the cost of the debt is much higher it's backfired quite dramatically. Is there a danger for National of running the tax cut line given all of that kind of global economic swirl?
There's a danger for both parties here. So with National, it's it's the idea that tax cuts are stimulatory, which they are. Then versus, for instance, if you want to draw an analogy, one of the most interesting aspects of the Liz Truss deal was putting a cap on energy prices. Now, that's quite regressive, right? It caps out the amount that everyone pays for their gas in particular, which is skyrocketing right now because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so it's regressive because poor people will still pay a relatively significant, around sort of like getting up near 50%, 30 to 50% increase in their energy bills. Rich people will still only pay that amount. Costs the government a massive amount, huge amount. You're getting into percentages of GDP here, and perversely, it doesn't dampen down the demand, which is too much. And that's sort of what causes inflation, right? Too much demand, not enough stuff. So there's. Where this government could get into trouble with that is, that's essentially what they've done with gasoline on oil in a much lesser sense by keeping that 25-cent reduction in the excise tax on rather than, say, targeted assistance to poorer motorists. Right, so everyone who's filling up their 180 sort of litre SUV gets the same discount that everyone else gets, and they actually get more benefit out of it, and that's stimulatory, right? And with the by itself probably not too much of an issue, but if the government has gotten a taste for this kind of regulation of prices. And there's nothing to suggest they haven't, then we might see sort of, more action that way, that causes confidence to fall. And the other thing is government spending. So part of the reason the markets reacted so negatively to the Truss mini budget was that it still increased borrowing and debt. The government hasn't given, in part because of the big cost of these excise discounts, getting near $1 billion. And if they extend it through to the election, which they may feel they have no choice to, that's another $1 billion. That doesn't give them a lot of headroom in terms of where they've budgeted for contingencies and new operational spending in their budget for this coming year. Now, it's an election budget. They'll probably want to sort of, hand out a few treats, win a few votes. So they might be tempted to also borrow more. I think Luxon said that, they haven't ruled out borrowing in order to fund tax cuts and the rest of their plan.
Well, he sort of was a bit back and forth this morning on that. Yeah.
And Labour are probably in the same position. So I think the sort of perverse electoral incentives don't necessarily lead us to a good place for either of the major parties.
Speaking of government debt, I was amused to see that in the mood of the boardroom survey, one of the key issues of concern identified was government debt, which I thought was ironic given that most of those guys' business models is jacked up around how to pay absolute minimal tax. But just coming back to the poll, I think the takeaway from it for Labour is that if you don't do stupid shit, you have a really good chance of winning the next election against all odds, despite COVID and all of the stuff that they've had to deal with, rising inflation. They have a very good chance. And so they need to be really judicious about what legislation they're pushing through Parliament between now and the election.
There's a lot on the plate.
It's a fine balance, isn't it? Because there's sort of, do you pick your winners and be cautious? Do you be incrementalist, as Jacinda Ardern has said is her preference in the past? Or do you say, well, there's a 50-50 chance we won't be in government. How much stuff do we want to slam through, get it embedded, like they did with the Māori Health Authority with Health New Zealand, in the certain knowledge that National will just sort of go, well, it's too much hassle to unwind it.
I think that's where the dumb shit test comes in, doesn't it? Because the Māori Health Authority is not dumb shit. The GST on KiwiSaver is kind of dumb shit. You know, this is not the argument that you have
Is
at
Three
this
Waters,
point in the electoral
Three Waters dumb shit?
cycle. I think Three Waters...
it literally is.
It literally is. I mean, we have to fix our water assets. Like, we have a massive water asset problem. On the Hui, we do stories all the time about communities that either go without water or they drink brown water or they literally have no water. So something has to be done about it. I don't know if Three Waters...
Income insurance, is that dumb shit?
I don't know enough about income insurance.
I mean, this is the
That's
problem,
Ben's
that
department.
each one of them kind of, each one of these legislative planks has an argument and a group of people that are firmly behind it and a rationale. But whether or not at some point you have to start kind of lightening the load.
I thought the
insurance.
social security system was income insurance, so I'm not sure why we need like another one. Like, I don't understand why we don't just
it was the unions and
improve
NZ,
our...
wasn't it?
This is one issue with sort of starting to falter in the polls as the government has, over the past probably 10 months, I guess, which is that, Business New Zealand was on board in co-designing the fair pay agreements. Business NZ was on board co-designing the income insurance. As National has crept up in the polls and the chances of a centre-right government after 2023, late next year, Business New Zealand has become a little less firm in its support.
It's almost as if there's been
a few
It's almost as if there's been a shift in the mood of the boardroom. You might say this is the mood of the pod studio, of course. Annabelle, you mentioned the Māori Party and the flying waka and the elaborate drag race that we've depicted for our listeners today. Winston Peters is still there on his novelty amphibious shark at 3%, and he's been at 3% for a couple of years. He's doing what he's done since time immemorial, which is he's now working the Rotary clubs, the Lions clubs. He's going around the country. He's pulling full houses in Warkworth and Tauranga, the backbone of the country, and 3% is not bad. 3% is not bad, and I think Ben Thomas has ruled him out in contradiction of the first commandment of New Zealand politics. He's got it. He can, and if you look at some of the other kind of the various tamaki vehicles and all those sorts of things, there's no reason why he might not. If he gets up to 4, then it becomes a serious threshold thing.
I 100% support Ben.
So,
I don't think that he's coming back.
Annabelle and Ben are both
and I
sticking
don't
with
think
ruling
that
out
once he's getting followed by cameras and stuff.
Really?
I don't think that he's going to look very impressive. I don't think he's going to inspire people to come out and vote. Okay. I think he's going to lose his vote to ACT, which is a much slicker machine nowadays. I just don't think he's going to inspire another 2%, and he has no seat, so...
Ben, are you sticking with your ruling out Winston Peters New Zealand First Party?
Sticking with it. He's gone. He's buried. I think ACT have successfully taken up that position. I don't think that in this very centrist race there's going to be much of a call for a handbrake. Presumably, at least some of the pool of potential Winston Peters voters will be having lucid moments and will remember that he wasn't, that he wasn't particularly much of a handbrake.
But the handbrake, I mean, like in the history of New Zealand First's relatively short life, the handbrake has only been a relatively recent phenomenon, hasn't it? As a concept, I don't know.
No, it's always been keep the bastards honest, right?
Yeah, I guess
and, I think with Luxon, if you were voting to change the government, do you need to vote for Winston Peters for that? If you were voting to keep Luxon on a short leash, well, is there a need for that? And if there is, you would probably be going for ACT, because ACT have very much pared down the prominence of their economic platform, which tends to be less popular, and they're very much... on the sort of small government, pairing off sort of, what we'd call waste, and getting into this, what we might call the conservative, even though they come from a very liberal point of view, social issues, freedom of speech or whatever, and the things that cranks on middle-aged Facebook are concerned about.
Okay. Well, look, we can listen back to this podcast after the election and see where we were. My prediction, so that we can cut this for an edit later on, is Winston Peters will definitely get back into Parliament. My prediction is that Winston Peters is definitely not getting into Parliament. We can grab a take of that.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the pōtiki of the taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama for Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Sam Uffindell report, the Maria Dew report, Annabelle, emerged last week.
Did it?
Yes, did. You could barely see it through the veil of tears as you mourned our Queen.
Oh yeah.
We didn't get the report. We didn't get an executive summary. I'm not even sure if the National Caucus got to see much of it. It was sort of
different views.
Different views. At one point, it was reported that Uffindell himself hadn't seen the report, but then that was later corrected. Ben's raising his hand.
So there's been a lot of criticism of this. Where's the transparency? That kind of thing. I would suggest that let me posit a potential scenario in which you would want to not release the report, right? So the report deals with a very because
is this a factually based theory,
this is purely speculation based on what we know publicly, because that's all I know.
Speculation vibes,
and it's that people have said, well, we need full transparency. So what's happened is Maria Dew KC was commissioned to look into a very specific time frame and also hear any other complaints, but we've heard that no one else came forward saying that.
Well, we don't even really know that because what the scope of the report was.
Well, okay, sure.
We're going to vibe.
So the report, presumably its investigation and findings was confined to the events in a flat in Dunedin on a few nights or over a couple of months. 18 years ago. So, I think Sam Uffindell alluded to the fact that the other flatmates
So you think it was just about the flat? You don't think it was about the incident at King's as well?
No, because I think that was also... There's no denial of that.
It was, though, and this was stated clearly, there was... Maria Dew was tasked with inviting other reports
that's right. And
of any sort.
And she said that no one
came forward. Yeah, so it wasn't exclusively.
No. But what I mean is, so I think everyone had felt that the sort of high school issue was dealt with, and sort of a perpetual mark of shame on him or whatever. But the investigation the inquiry was there anything else? What happened in the Dunedin flat? So Uffindell again alluded to the fact that the other flatmates were invited to, be interviewed. You're talking, probably max a handful of people. Maria Dew KC concluded that, there wasn't, wrongdoing or whatever. This means, but was at pains to say, I don't think anyone lied. I don't think anyone tried to mislead anyone, Well, so I think you can kind of sort of take from that there were differing accounts of what happened.
Yes.
You couldn't really reach any conclusions, hazy memories, young people in a flat, that sort of thing. But you don't want to release a report, you wouldn't want to release a report which said, we spoke to this person who very generously gave her time, and then we found that her story didn't stack up. That's not a good way to treat somebody who's done that, because I don't think there's no suggestion anyone was at fault or anyone was lying about their recollections.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, it's not like we know who she is.
Well,
you can redact her name and stuff, so why would that actually matter?
Also, she has said she would like a redacted. She's on the record as saying she would like a redacted version of the report. I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, the other issue that raises, Ben, Annabelle, is where the evidentiary standard or whatever the term is, because
we saw this with the Labour report, right?
There are two differing accounts.
The Labour report was released. It had adverse findings about the complainant's credibility.
Yes.
And then the complainant...
Hang on, which Labour report are we talking about?
This was the one
about... the Labour staffer.
Yeah, a Labour staffer. And
then the complainant was appalled.
Then the complainants came to the spin-off and complained, wrote about how upset they felt about that report and about its findings. Then Andrea Vance wrote a column about how the complainant had misled her on factual issues. And, I would think that in terms of, even a complainant-led process, that's not necessarily what you actually want to expose people to.
I think that wouldn't prevent you from releasing the executive summary, particularly when the person has said that they're okay with it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
I mean, one of the interesting things was around the release of that report was whether or not it would prompt anyone else to come forward with anything, and so far that seems not to have happened. And so, on a political level, it feels as though this one is probably going to fade into the background a bit. I mean, obviously...
The problem is that, there's a credibility issue for National. You've got Simeon Brown, who's taking on Nanaia Mahuta demanding transparency, and that's fair enough. People are entitled to transparency and accountability. And then on the flip side, you've got them not even making public what the scope of it was, what the executive summary of it is. So it will fade into the background. But again, it's a bit like Sam himself getting up and doing his maiden speech about youth crime and stuff when you've been allegedly beating up kids yourself. And I think the problem with National in the long term is that their vote is skewing male, and they really need to get women voters on board, and the handling of issues like this make it difficult for them to win back the votes of women. And here's the thing, women care about what happens to their kids. Women want to feel safe in their flats and all of those things. So while it will fade into the background, actually, I think that it will resonate a little longer in the minds of women.
Oh, look, I certainly think that, the allegations and the sort of the general tenor of the issue will probably be with Uffindell for a long time, and voters will make their decisions about that, and I think people within the party will make their decisions, with that sort of knowledge informing it. In terms of the comparison, I think with either the investigation or the inquiry by the Public Service Commissioner into Nanaia Mahuta's alleged conflicts of interest, or apparent conflicts of interest. And also the comparisons that were made with, say, youth justice, for instance. I think there is a bit of context collapse there. The basis for the inquiry into Nanaia Mahuta's alleged apparent conflicts of interest.
It's more the questions of as much of the declarations of those conflicts.
Well, that's about the Cabinet Manual. Yeah, the Cabinet Manual lays out a very strict process for dealing with apparent conflicts of interest because, as it says correctly, apparent conflicts of interest are just as important as, direct conflicts of interest or actual conflicts of interest because... if something seems like it might be a conflict of interest, you can't just then take their word for it. Now in terms of a report into the National Party to see whether they think he's a person of good character to be an MP, there's a little more leeway in terms of transparency there, but voters can make their own decisions. In terms of the Cabinet Manual, it's very clear. Now, I personally, I don't necessarily think there's any obvious hanging offence here. if Nanaia Mahuta's husband is reputed to be an expert in sort of dozens of different areas of sort of public service endeavour, then that would only make him about the same as all the consultants that I've dealt with from PwC and in different government and private projects, who all seem to be apparently fucking experts in everything. But at the same time, you do. I think there was one where there was, I think, a direct conflict, which was the appointment of a woman who was identified as her niece. She identified as her niece, that she appointed to the He Puapua sort of task force or whatever that wrote that report, and the cabinet manual is sort of just dead set on that one. I don't see any way around that.
So what we've shifted
Can I
into
just come back to what you said, Ben? Like, yes, they're two different issues, but in the mind of the average voter, transparency is transparency, and I don't think they'll read a lot of conflict, a lot of context into it.
Yeah, but I think in terms of transparency, in terms of the cabinet manual, and in terms of conflicts, we have to have a different standard from just what the average voter thinks. Because I've seen a lot of this in terms of asking Simeon Brown, well, what about Nationals' conflicts of interest, or alleged conflicts of interest, or apparent conflicts of interest in government? And I would say, so what? I mean, those should have been, and in some cases were, subject to extreme scrutiny, just as anyone else was. But this is not an issue about, is National getting an advantage, is Labour getting an advantage, and it's just between the two of them to sort out. It's actually in the public interest.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it creates a credibility problem for National when they're demanding transparency, and rightly so on certain issues, but then they're not being transparent as they could be around the Sam Uffindell issue in the mind of the average voter.
Annabelle, on the Nanaia Mahuta thing, just in case people haven't caught up with this one, Peter Hughes has said he's going to look into it, the Public Services Commissioner. He's going to look into these purported conflicts of interest related to her husband, and across a range of different government ministries. I think there's 3 or 4. Is this inevitable? Is it the right thing? Do you think there has been a nastiness that has filtered through some of the commentary on this?
Yeah, well, let me preface this conversation by saying there's absolutely been a racist undertone to a lot of the commentary that we've seen online, not necessarily the reporting, but definitely the commentary on places like Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. It's been unacceptable.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. I think that it is the right thing to have an inquiry or an investigation. I think it's a shame it didn't happen sooner. If we're to look back at Nanaia's track record, she's pretty squeaky clean. There's not a whole lot of skeletons in her closet. She's known as an above board player. So I think in some ways it's been a mistake to let this issue just keep simmering away under the surface instead of cauterising it earlier. So I think it's a good thing that there's going to be an inquiry. And some of the things that we're talking about, it's a really quite a specific skill set that they're looking for that aren't widely held, and quite community specific as well. So I don't think that it's particularly scandalous that people like her niece, a lot of these people have incredible reputations for the mahi that they do, have got these contracts, but we have to, politicians have to be scrupulous in the way that they not only declare their conflicts of interest, but manage them. So I think an inquiry is a good thing. I imagine that she will probably more than likely come out clear. I just think it's a shame that it didn't happen sooner, so she hasn't had to. So we haven't had to listen to the quite racist rhetoric that's bubbled up around this.
Ben, in the nature of New Zealand, a relatively small country, in particular sectors, communities, industries, whatever. I interviewed Nick Smith the other week and had quite a long, interesting chat with him about Smith Cranes and Concrete, which is the family business, him and his brothers, and they're building wind farms, and they've done wind farms for a long time, and they're the only one with the cranes big enough. And of course, you know, when Nick Smith was in government contracts, there is absolutely no suggestion that there was anything wrong that happened there. There's just only so many people who have the big cranes.
No, for sure. And look, in terms of perception, so a lot of this is about perception, but it is important that we get the perception right.
Yeah.
It's very important that these conflicts, because we're such a small country, are properly managed.
Agree.
Now, that example that I talked about with her niece on the He Puapua thing, that was just a violation of the Cabinet Manual, dead set to rights, and they need to apologise for that and show that they've learned something from it. And this is the Prime Minister's job, right, to police the Cabinet Manual and the Cabinet Secretary. So that was a failing there. And these other ones, I think
she's busy policing Marama's chocolate.
I suspect it will. I suspect it'll probably come out all right. In terms of some of these conflicts that we do talk about, and for instance, I think Labour brought up Sir Witta Gardner, R.I.P.
Actually, National brought up Sir Witta Gardner. It was your former boss who raised the fact that Witta got.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the thing is, so here is just some free PR advice for anyone who is a consultancy across myriad areas and wants to get and wants to get contracts from government departments. Just set up your polymathic consultancy just a little bit before your partner becomes a Minister of the Crown. If you've got a track record of even 18 months, people will ask fewer questions.
That's
right?
advice from
it's just
Thomas
just for optics.
And
right?
the blurb for this.
You get that for free.
Festival was described as a PR maven.
Okay,
was it Raven? I forget which. Maybe it was both at one point.
I got to go anyway.
Yeah, we're going to wind this up. I just want to apologise to the Real Pod. It's definitely a thing, and we know it's a thing. It's a great podcast. Have you had a chance to catch Real Pod lately, Ben? You've been so busy, Ben. I'm worried you haven't been getting your Real Pod fix.
I'm extremely busy, but I always listen to the Real Pod.
It's available on all podcast providers, as is this podcast, which you probably know. Why don't you give us 10 stars and a lovely review? Thanks to our Thanks members, thanks bells. Ben is leaving the building.
Ben's running away. Bye.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.